Hi, welcome to the channel. I'm Lauro Miller and I make videos about programming. Today we'll talk about promises. In the previous video we had a little bit more theoretical discussion about the event loop and asynchronous programming in JavaScript, and today we'll see how we can implement it by using promises. This video is quite detailed and extensive to make sure that we cover all the important aspects of the topic. So let's check the agenda and let's get started. Here's the agenda for what we'll cover in this part when we talk about promises. We start with the basics of using promises and the syntax of promises. We then move on to talking about the different states of promises, and then we take a deeper dive into the then and the catch methods. We will briefly talk about the finally method, and we'll finish by having some small discussion about how to handle errors in promises. Let's start with a new file here, and I'm gonna call this basics.js. Promises are just another way for us to deliver asynchronous results. So here I'll just write down promises are an alternative way of delivering asynchronous results. So remember in the last discussion, last part of this introduction series, we talked about the callback pattern where we had some function here, and then we can say some async logic, for example, and then we would pass a callback which would be executed with, in some cases, that would be the result. In other cases, you would have an error here in the first as the first argument, and then the result as the second, and we would do something here with the error and with the result, right? So this was one pattern we saw to deliver asynchronous results. The promises are another pattern. So a promise is an object to which we can register callbacks. The simplest way for us to visualize this is to simply say promise dot, and then we could, for example, say resolve, and then we will register a callback that is going to be executed with the value from this resolve. Let's just try to see let's try to visualize how this actually works. So we're gonna have some result here, and we'll console.log this result on the screen. Console.log the result. Okay, so here we have the promise. We are directly calling the resolve. We will understand this in a bit, how this means or how this works. And then we are registering this callback here. That's the callback, which is going to be executed with the value from this resolve. I'm going to save this and I will execute this on the screen. So let's switch to the console and run a node basics.js. And you will see that it's going to print 1, 2, 3 as expected. If I were to, for example, console.log here another line, so hello world, for example, and I save this and then I run the code, you see that hello world actually prints before 1, 2, 3. So you start to see some asynchronous behavior here, right? So this callback is executed after the console.log hello world. Now, in promises or in promise objects, the resolve method is used to indicate that the promise has settled with a successful value, that there was no error inside of the promise. And we also have its, let's say, quote unquote, sibling method, the reject method, which is going to reject a promise, meaning that some error, some problem happened during the asynchronous execution of the promise. So let's say here that we have, for example, something went wrong. And we will see that this .then here is not going to be executed. I'm going to save this, I'm going to run the code, and you will see that we have some warnings, and these warnings are exactly due to the fact that we do not have the necessary callback to handle promise rejection. So let's try to add this. I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. And then here, to handle rejections, to handle errors from promises, we need to add this catch callback. And the catch callback is nothing more than, it's very similar to the then callback, but it's going to be executed in case the promise gets rejected. So here we'll also console.log the error. Okay, this is just going to print something went wrong on the screen. If I execute this, you see there you have the message, something went wrong. So the idea of promises is they offer us an object which is going to provide or is going to deliver some asynchronous, is going to deliver results asynchronously, and we can register a callback in case these results are successfully delivered, and another callback in case these results are not successfully delivered, meaning there is some error in the execution of the asynchronous code. So let's see how we can implement a function which will actually return a promise and which will use these two constructs, reject and resolve. So here I'm going to delete this whole thing and I'm going to create a new, for example, subtract async, right? So we already talked a bit about the subtract logic. I mean, it's a simple example. You get A and B. And then here, let's think about the sync method first. So just subtract here AB, and then we will return A minus B, right? So that's a very straightforward way of executing the subtract function. But if we want to turn the subtract function into an async function, then we would have the async here. And instead of directly returning A minus B, we are going to return a new promise. Oops. There you go. And we're going to return a new promise. And this new promise here, it receives as a parameter what is called an executor. And this executor provides us those two little keywords, the resolve and the reject methods, right? So now here we can think a little bit about the logic. If, for example, type of A is different than number, or type of B is different than number. So if any of the two parameters of this function or any of the two arguments are not numbers, so this is also different than number, then we want to reject this promise with a message that please provide numbers as inputs, right? If this is not the case, then we simply just want to resolve the promise with A minus B, like so. And here I'm going to add an else. And then that is exactly what's going to happen. Okay, so if the type of the parameters is not correct, then we are going to reject the promise. Otherwise, we're going to resolve with the correct value, A minus B. Now let's see how we can subscribe or how we can register some callbacks to be executed once this promise is settled. So here we'll have subtract async, let's say 1 and 2, and then we can register a callback for when this promise is successfully settled, and this is going to receive some value. We can also console.log this value, and we can register the catch method here. Oops, sorry, the catch callback, which is going to receive the error, and we will console.log the error. One possible or another possible way for us here is not just to provide the reason, but to actually provide a new error, like so. This is also fine. We don't need to throw it here. It's also possible for us to throw from within the promise, but we don't have to do so. If we just call the reject method with a new error, this will already activate the .catch callback. So now we are subtracting async with 1 and 2, and then here we could say console.log hello world, and we would still see the correct result. So let's save this and execute here, and we first print hello world, and then we print -1. Let's now try to add an invalid call to this promise, right? So we will pass a string as the first argument and then a number as the second argument, and we will just copy and paste this whole two things here. So the then and the catch methods. I'm going to save this, and now we should see hello world, and then either -1 first and then the error, or the error and then -1. And here, to prevent, actually, if I print this whole error, it's going to print a lot of stuff on the screen. You see here, there you go, you have the whole error. It seems like this was thrown and it led the program to exit with a non-zero state and that everything blew up, but that's not really the case. This is just due to this console.log here. If I were to change from error to error.message, that's also fine. It's just going to print the line. And as you can see, we could actually continue the execution of the code. So this is quite nice because we could, for example, console.log, I will also print, for example. And if I save this and I execute, then you see that it also prints here at the bottom of the screen. So rejecting a promise doesn't really break the whole code. It's going to execute the function from within the catch method, and it's going to continue the execution without a problem, okay? Except, of course, if you throw something here, if you throw a new error here, then this is going to block the execution of the code. I will just demonstrate it here. So let's mark the basics of using promises as completed, and let's talk about the different states of promise. I have a little diagram here which can help to understand the different states of promises, and whenever we create a new promise, this promise is in a pending state. Okay, it's always in the pending state until it gets settled, or it may be the case that it never gets settled, so it remains in this pending state. A promise is settled whenever it is fulfilled or rejected. Okay, fulfilled, so a promise is then fulfilled by this call to resolve, and it is rejected with this call to reject. Let's create a new file here, and I want to explore a few different constructs for us to understand a little bit better the different states of a promise. So I'm going to call this states.js. So let's start by creating 3 simple promises. The first one is going to be fulfilled, and this is going to be a new promise, which is going to receive an executor just with resolve. And I'm going to console.log I am settled and fulfilled, like so. And here, of course, not console.log, sorry, but resolve. And then we will have another one, const rejected. And this is going to be, again, a new promise. And here the executor has to receive 2 arguments because I want to call the second one, but the first one is not important. So I just underscore resolve, and then here I'll call reject with I am settled and rejected, like so. And the third one is the pending promise. So this pending promise is simply going to be new promise here, like so. And then we will say console.log I will never settle. Okay, so here that this promise will never settle because we are not calling the resolve nor the reject methods. Now let's see how the different promises, they are going to actually activate, or they will call the registered callbacks for the .then and for the .catch method. So we'll have fulfilled .then, and then here we can get some value, and we'll simply console.log this value, right? Then we can also have the .catch here, just to .catch, and then here we will have an error as well, and we will console.log the error. Now we will have the not fulfilled, but the rejected promise, and then we have again .then and .catch, and in the end here we have the pending .then and .catch. So as you can imagine, based on what we just discussed, for the first one we are going to execute the callback registered with the then method, which means we are going to console.log I am settled and fulfilled. For the rejected one, we are going to execute the .catch, and here, just for the sake of differentiating, I'm going to actually console.log, so something like this, and I'm going to say console.log, and then here promise was rejected with, and then I will interpolate the value of the error, just like so, so that we can see the difference between the .then and the .catch. Okay, so for the first one, again, it's gonna just print the message I am settled and fulfilled. For the second one here, for the rejected one, it's going to print the capital letters plus the message. And for the third one, it's actually going to print just the I will never settle. The I will never settle will still print on the screen. Even though the promise is not settled, the code from within the promise is going to be executed synchronously. So if I save this, now let's see what we get as a result in the terminal. So I will run node states.js, and then you see that the first one to print is the I will never settle message, and that's quite interesting. And this happens because the code from within the function, when we start the execution of the function, it starts executing synchronously, but as it turns out, the function or the promise is going to settle asynchronously, which means that if we do some asynchronous calls here, we can then pass the resolve and reject, and then this will be used to settle the promise asynchronously. But the execution of the code, it starts synchronously. So this is the first line to be printed on the screen, and then we get I am settled and fulfilled. That comes from the first promise, and then we get the promise was rejected with I am settled and rejected. So this is from the rejected promise. This should be enough for us to understand the different states of promises. Let's now move on to discussing the then method. So new file here, and I'm going to call this then.js. Let's create a new function here, and I will actually copy from the basics file. I'll just copy the subtract async function. As we already know, once I call subtract async here with 1 and 2, and I chain a then callback, this is going to be executed with the value from resolve from the promise. If I pass value here, then I could do some stuff. I could do some different operations with this value, right? So if I have something like this, and here, because I have a reject, I also need to add the catch, and the catch will simply say error, and I will print, so console.log error.message, right? So here we'll focus on the then method and what we could do with the then method. And actually here, for our purposes, maybe we could even use another construct that is available, which is not to use the function, but to use promise.resolve. This is going to create a promise which is settled and fulfilled with the value that is passed to this resolve here. So if I were to say 1, 2, 3, for example, then, and here I console.log 1, 2, 3, or console.log the value, this is going to print 1, 2, 3 on the screen. Let's save this and let's run the code here. I'll clear and then run a node then.js. It simply prints 1, 2, 3 on the screen. Now let's take a deeper dive into how, or the different ways that we can work with this .then. The first thing that we need to understand is that .then, both .then and .catch, they return new promises, which means that we can chain multiple .then and multiple .catch methods one after the other. So how do we visualize that they actually return promises? Well, one way of doing that is simply, let's say, just test var, and here our test promise, right? And if we console.log, let's console.log the test promise here, and we will see that we'll have a promise in the pending state. So once I run this, you see that it prints promise pending. It does not print any value here. It does not print 1, 2, 3. It prints that this test promise is actually a promise object, which is in the pending state, as we saw previously. So now that we know that .then really returns a promise, we could, for example, have something like this. We will have the .then, and then we multiply this by 2. So let's say here we'll simply say value times 2. And once I return a promise here, then I can actually chain another one, and I can actually chain the value again. And here I can console.log the value. So now this is going to take 1, 2, 3, is going to multiply by 2 in the first then, and then it's going to print in the second then. So it's going to print 246. If I save this and run the code, you see that it prints 246. Now you can imagine that we can chain multiple asynchronous calls here, because we actually return also promises from within the .then function. Similarly, if I were to actually throw an exception from within my then method here, so throw new exception or throw new error, I am an annoying exception. If I were to throw a new error, and if I were to add a catch block here, and then console.log this error on the screen, console.log error.message, then I should also be able to print the error message on the screen. Let's try this again, and then you will see that it simply prints the I am an annoying exception. So it does not print the 246 because the exception is thrown from within the first then. Okay, even if I were to actually return here value times 2, this return statement will never be reached because the error will simply interrupt the execution of this code block. If I save this and I run it again, you see I am an annoying exception once again. So as you can see, this is quite nice because we can chain and have a very clean flow of executing different functions based on the results of the previous promise. A final possibility for some return value from the .then method is to actually have a new promise being returned. So imagine that I make another function call here, another asynchronous call, and then I return something from this asynchronous call, or I actually return the promise from this asynchronous call. So let's try to now return a promise.resolve, but now with ABC instead of returning 1, 2, 3, or instead of returning value times 2. So imagine that I have this structure like so. So I execute some code with 1, 2, 3, and then based on the result, I actually execute, or I run some other asynchronous code, and then I return the promise from that asynchronous code. The next then is going to operate over the value of the previously returned promise. So this promise that is returned here, it is going to substitute, quote unquote, the promise that is originally returned by the .then method. If I were to run this code now in the third line here, in the .then from the third line, you will see that we will print ABC on the console. If I run this, there you have our ABC. So this is effectively one way that we can substitute, or we can actually use the result from previous promises to execute more asynchronous code, and then make sure that the subsequent calls to then and catch, they are operating over the return value from the last promise. One thing that we can do here is to actually do some quite nice exercise to try to remember that in the previous discussion we read some file asynchronously, right? So we required the file system, and then we had fs.read file. And then this fs.read file would receive some file name, let's say example.txt, and then a callback. And the callback would have an error here, and it would have the result here, or actually the data, right? This would have the data. And sorry, here the read file should be like so. And then here, if there was an error, then we would simply throw an exception, throw new error with the error maybe, or we could console.log, let's say console.log the error, else we would simply console.log the data.toString with, let's say, UTF-8, like so. Now what we can do is to actually turn this whole thing into a promise, right? So we could, for example, create a new arrow function here that's going to be read file async, and we are going to add some additional logic here because we're going to pass the file name as a variable. Now, instead of reading here directly the example.txt, here we would read with file name like so. So let's just try to actually work with this structure. I'm going to create a new file here, and I'm going to say example.txt like so. Okay, and then I will simply write my content like so. I will save this, and then here I will call read file async with example.txt. Okay, so this is just a simple wrapper around our fs.read file function, which allows me to pass the file name dynamically. So if I save this and I run with node, and what's the file name, then it's still the den.js, it's going to print my content like it did before. Now we just have the possibility of actually passing the file name. Now here, let's say that instead of directly returning fs.read file, we actually return a new promise. Okay, so let's write the whole thing, let's wrap the whole thing around a new promise here. And here I think I need to pass an additional one, exactly. And then now within the executor, we'll have a resolve and a reject. And now here, let me just put this whole thing in a new line, wrap things around a little bit just to make it a little bit nicer, like so. And then now here, if there is an error, I'm going to reject the promise. And if there is no error, I will resolve the promise. So as you can see, I am just wrapping up the read file here with a promise, and then I am rejecting the promise if there is an error when reading the file. Otherwise, I'm resolving the promise if there are no errors. So here we'll say read file async, and we will register the callbacks here. Then we're going to have some value, and we will console.log the value. Otherwise, we will get a .catch here, which is going to have an error, and we will console.log the error. Okay, now the error here, it's not exactly a JavaScript traditional error. It is a specific error to the read file. If I were actually to enter the declaration of this read file here, I'm not sure exactly where are the types, but if you investigate a little bit, you would find this type here, and this would indicate how the error actually looks like. Let's give it a try by first passing a correct file name. So I'm going to save this, and now I'm going to execute it. And as you can see, I have it printed my content here. Now, if I change the file name to an invalid name, then once I execute, then exactly I have the error printed on the screen. Now, one interesting thing is that because I can chain multiple calls of the same promise, or because I can chain multiple promise calls, let's say that within my example.txt file, I have some other reference. So I have the name of another file, another example.txt. Now here I'm going to create a new file and I will say another example.txt and I will say this is my actual content. Okay, so this is just to adding a little bit more complexity here, just to show you how easy it is for us to actually chain multiple promises together. So from the first read file async, we will resolve with the value of the file. So the value of the file is going to be, or the content of the file is going to be this another example.txt. And then we will actually simply return the value. Okay, so we receive the value as a result, and then we return the value immediately, which will return a promise that is going to have this value as the fulfillment value, to which we can actually chain another promise for this value here, or actually even better, let's, instead of returning the value, we can return here read file async once again with the value. Now we will see that this will actually wrap things up and it's going to return a new promise, which is going to execute this read file on the new value that was received from example.txt. So here we will have an example.txt that returns another example.txt, and then in the next iteration, so this value here, actually maybe we can do this. Let's do this step by step. I will console.log the value here, right? So this, let's say, value from first promise, and then I'm gonna wrap things up here like so, and then I will return this promise, right? So I'll return read file async, and then because I am returning a promise, remember what we just discussed, that if I return a promise from within the .then method, this returned promise becomes the effective promise. So now here I have again the .then value, and this is going to have the value of our another example.txt file. So now if I were to console.log error here, or value, sorry, then let's see what this prints on the screen. So I'm gonna save this whole thing, and then I'm gonna execute it, and you will see it prints value from first promise, another example.txt, and then this is my actual content. So it correctly executes these two promises one after the other. If I want to have a more compact syntax or a more compact construct, then you can see that this is very easy to follow, right? If I save this and I execute this, I just don't print the first line from before, but I still print the correct content. If I were to have an invalid file name here, for example, I'm just going to save this, then this will actually activate the .catch here in the end. If I execute, then you will see that we print the error from within the callback registered with the .catch method. Okay, now maybe your head is spinning around. My head is spinning around a little bit because it's, again, an entirely different way of working with code in JavaScript, but hopefully I was able to give you an idea of how we can ensure the sequential execution of the code, even if we have asynchronous code in JavaScript. This is why we work with promises, because we can then really have a flat structure that shows how the code is sequentially executed. Now, I just want, and I think you're gonna hate me for that, but I'm gonna go back a little bit and I'm gonna show you one of the problems that this simple pattern resolves. If we don't have promises and we have just something like this, for example, fs.read file, and then here I will just pass the example.txt, right? So like so. And then here I don't have the reject, so I would console.log the error, and I need to clean this up a little bit, like so. And this whole thing can go away. So now imagine that I have a simple plain callback structure, right? So I have a callback pattern to operate with asynchronous values. Now, if I wanted to do again this read file function from within my callback, I would have to pass this read file function once again to my callback. So I would have to do something like this. And then here I would have to pass the file here with the content, so with data.toString utf8 like so, and then here I would console.log the file. If I save this, and here I think I need to example like so, and I execute this, then I have my actual content printed on the screen. It's no problem. It works. Okay, this is the callback pattern for you. So we have a callback, but as you can imagine, this can very quickly get super confusing, because imagine that we are doing some file. So we are reading some file here, and then we are doing some network request with the results of this file, which is also an asynchronous function. And then we are doing some other asynchronous operation with the result of that network request. So we would start nesting a lot of callbacks inside callbacks inside callbacks. And this is what is known as the callback hell in JavaScript. And that's because we start with too many callbacks, right? And then it of course becomes practically impossible to understand the code. And this is one of the promises, or one of the problems that promises resolve. So, or the promises fix, right? Because of the resolve here. But this is one of the problems that promises address. As you can see, it's much easier to follow the structure of the code if we have a flat promise structure like this. And that's where the then, and the fact that the then method returns a promise. So that's where its true power comes into play. That's by really simplifying this whole flow of information that we can use promises, and we can ensure that we're still working with asynchronous code, but in a much easier, much more straightforward way to understand it. Awesome, quite nice. So as you can see, we can really simplify the understanding of the code by chaining multiple .then methods. Let's now have a look at the .catch method, which is actually very similar to the .then method, but it allows us to also do some quite interesting things, because it allows us to handle errors in a much more graceful way. So here, let's create a new file. I'm gonna call this catch.js. For analyzing the catch method, let's try to create a new function here, and we will say calc name length async, like so, right? So we will simply receive a person here, and then we will return a new promise, and this promise is going to have again the resolve and reject. And then here we'll do things a little bit differently. So let me just pass here to a new line. We're going to do things a little bit differently. We are not going to use the reject. We'll simply throw an exception by mistake, right? So let's say that our code is buggy and we are throwing some exception from within the function. So here we will say resolve with person dot name dot length. Like so, right? So this assumes that the person object that is passed here is going to have a property called name, and this property name is going to have a length. So now here I don't need a reject, and this is a very simple promise which just returns the person.name.length asynchronously, right? You could also think that this could be some network request or something, and it would operate on the result. Now let's see what happens if I actually pass a valid person, so name here max, and then I have the .then method here, and that's going to be the length, and I will simply console.log the length. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to execute the code with node catch.js, and I print 3 correctly, right? Now, what happens if I pass an invalid person? What happens if I pass, for example, just something here, right? So this person is actually a string, and as you know, string has no name. So the person.name here is going to be undefined, which means that the .length is going to throw an error. Let's see what happens. Once I execute this, as you see, we have a lot of problems on the screen. And here it's simply an unhandled promise rejection warning, right? So if I were to actually have the catch method here, and I will say this is an error, and I console.log the error, for example, the error.message, and I save this, then I'm going to have a very nice message printed on the screen. Let's clear everything and run again. There you go. That's our message, right? So now we are using the catch method to simply console.log something on the screen. But if we come here and we switch the order and we actually add the catch method before, and we say, okay, there was some error, maybe what we can do is, for example, console.log, or here, yeah, exactly, console.log, there was an error, and then we'll simply print the error.message. And then we will say here in a new line, defaulting to 0. And then we will simply return 0 from the catch method. Now what's going to happen is we are going to console.log this nice message on the screen, and we will return 0. So we should see there was an error, and then we should see the error message. We should see defaulting to 0, and then we should see 0 printed on the screen. Let's save this and let's see that's exactly what happens, right? So as you can see, very nice error handling here, and it allows us to do quite a few powerful things. Of course, if I were to simply pass the catch afterwards, this is not going to work. So I'm not going to print here. If I save this and I execute, I will just print the error, and the then method is not going to be executed. And the reason here is because the then method is executed on the promise that is returned from the catch method. If I switch the order, the then method here is executed on the promise that is returned from my original function, right? So now let's give it a try, for example, and pass here a valid argument. So if I pass a valid person with a name of Max, then we should see 3 on the screen without any problems. And that's exactly what happens, because this promise here, once it gets successfully fulfilled with the resolve call, it's going to activate, it's going to execute the callback that is passed to this .then. So it will just skip over the .catch, and it's going to execute the code from .then. That's it for a deeper dive into the catch method. So as you can see, we can actually use this catch to do some graceful error handling and to use some default values for the next promises in the chain, right? So let's mark this as completed, and let's briefly talk about the finally method. Well, the finally method is, if you remember, I'm just going to create a new file here, finally.js. And if you remember from our try catch with an error and finally here, so remember from our previous discussion was a couple of videos ago, but we had such a structure, right? So we had a try block, we had a catch block, which is going to be executed if any error is thrown from within this try block, and then we have the finally block, which was always executed independently if an error was thrown or not from within the try block. Well, with promises, it's quite the same, right? So here, if I have, for example, let me copy the same function from before, and if I chain a .finally here, .finally, and I'll say simply console.log, I will always execute. Right, so we can count on the finally call here, or the finally callback, always being executed from the promises. So even if I execute the catch or only the catch, the finally will also be executed. Even if I execute only the then callback, the finally callback will also be executed. So let's try to create 2 here. And the first one is going to be the correct one. The second one is going to be an invalid one. Invalid, like so. I'm going to save this, and back here at the console, clear everything and run node finally.js. And then you see that both of them print I will always execute. We print it twice. The first one is printed from the first, and the second one is printed from the second. So quick discussion about the finally method. You know it's there, you know how you can use it, some use cases I just mentioned. Maybe you come across the need to use it for something else. It's just important that you know it exists. So let's mark this as completed. And now let's talk a little bit about error handling in promises. So back here in the IDE, let me create a new file, and I'm going to call this errors.js. Now, so far we have been using functions, or we have been creating arrow functions which directly return promises, right? So we had something like some promise, which would receive some parameters, and then that would be new promise directly like so, right? So here we would have some executor, but as it may happen, we can also do some synchronous code execution and then return a new promise here. So let's say that we receive a number. So we will say do some sync stuff and return promise, and then receive a number. And then here we will say console.log, we received we received the number, and then here I'm going to just pass num here, and I will return, then for the sake of being brief, let's say new return promise.resolve with num times 2, right? So I'm just multiplying the number by 2. And then let's see what happens once I actually have this do something stuff and return promise with 3. And I chain a then method here, .then, and then I have the value, and then I console.log the value. Now here I will just, again, for showing how the program will actually execute the flow, I'm gonna console.log a new line. So before, we actually were consoling, or we were logging the hello world before the result of the promise. This will also be the case here, that we will log the hello world before the result of the promise. However, once we have a function that returns a promise, this execution before returning the promise, it is a synchronous execution. So it's a space synchronous execution. This console.log will execute before the hello world. It's going to be, we receive the number 3, and then we'll print hello world, and then we will print the result, which is 6. Let's save this and let's run the code here with, so I'm just going to clear, and then node errors.js, and then you see that we received the number 3, and then hello world, and then 6. If I were to throw an error here, because this is outside of the promise, this will actually break the whole code. So if for some reason I say if type of, right? So if type of num is different than number, I throw a new error like so, please provide a valid input. And then I add a .catch method here. Let's say here's some error, and I will console.log error.message. So let's say that, okay, I'm gonna throw the error, and then I'm gonna catch the error here, and I'm gonna execute some nice code afterwards, and I continue the program. That is not what's going to happen. Exactly, because this code is executed synchronously. So let's pass an incorrect input with 3, for example, and let's see how the code executes. Now, once I run it, as you can see, we actually have directly an error thrown, and the line hello world is not printed, nor is the result of the promise, nor is the input here, because I removed it, right? So if I were to simply say here console.log, let's do it again. We receive number and then num. We will see that this is not going to execute. So if I save this and run it again, then you see it does not execute any of the code following this exception, because the exception is thrown before the promise is actually created. If I were to return a new promise here, which then receives an executor with resolve, and then from within the promise, I actually do this whole thing here, right? Then we will see that, and then here I will say resolve with the value of num times 2. Then because this promise is going to throw here, then this is going to be caught by the catch block. Let's run this, and as you can see, we print successfully the hello world, and we print please provide a valid input. We do not print this file we do not print this line, because we are throwing the error before this line. If I were to simply move the error above, or move the line above the error, then we will also print the line. So node errors.js, we print the line, and of course here that's invalid. I mean, here it's printing as a string, right? But let's put say ABC here to be clear. So we print it correctly, we print the hello world, and then we execute the catch block, because the error was thrown from within the promise. So do not confuse throwing errors from the outside of the promise from throwing errors or using the reject function from within the promise, right? This can lead to actually quite a few nasty consequences, because code that works with promises and code that returns promises, they expect all these errors to happen from within the promise. Or so you may find most of the times that the codes, they do not really wrap the whole thing with a try, for example, like this, right? Try, and then we'll say catch an error, and then we have the promise here, and then it is okay to actually throw this error from the outside, because I'm gonna catch this error here, right? So I'm gonna catch this error in this block of code, and then I could, let's say, console.log, something went wrong. Here, I said it's okay. It's not okay, right? It's not okay because the dot catch here is not really going to be executed from the promise. So it's not the best design. As you can see, we just get something went wrong and then hello world. So this is a way of like double securing your program to avoid these bad design practices. So throwing an error from outside of the promise does not break the whole thing, but still this is not the recommended way. The recommended way is for us to actually stick to the correct execution or the correct flow. And when using promises and working with promises, ensuring that the errors that we throw, they are either thrown from within the promise or that we don't throw anything, we simply reject the promise with a new error with this message, right? So here, if I add the reject parameter here, then this will also print everything correctly. Now, some of the code that you work with may not be developed by you, so you cannot ensure that this is going to be the pattern used in every library that is out there. However, I think it's important for you to follow this convention in your own code so that other people who work with your code, and also maybe you in the future, when you know that a promise is returned, you can rely that both the .then and the .catch method are going to work correctly and that no exception is going to be thrown from the outside of the promise. Of course, you cannot ensure that there will never be synchronous logic here before the promise, but and it may be the case, let's say that I wanted to console.log num dot, I don't know, name dot length, for example, and this is going to throw an exception by itself. I'm not directly throwing the exception, but this will throw an error by itself because name is undefined here. And also for this type of code, then you would have to be a bit more careful because you need to keep in mind that exceptions may arise just by bad code design, and you would like to prevent these exceptions in this synchronous part of the code as much as possible. That's it for today, and hopefully by now it's much clearer how we can use and benefit from promises in JavaScript. In the next video, we'll talk about the async await syntax. And of course, if you don't want to miss that, make sure to subscribe to the channel and you'll get a notification when the video is out. I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.